morning. My name is Dr. Christopher Chiari. I am a professor at Purdue University. I was going to introduce everyone, but I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So we're going to start over here.
Good evening. Good morning, everybody. My name is John. My name is John Pizan Jr. I'm a doctoral candidate in music education from the University of Florida. I am based in Jacksonville, Florida, with my wife, who's a first grade teacher, and Koji Kondo, Sonic the Hedgehog, and DDR are my things.
I'm Jared O'Leary. I work at a nonprofit. I create resources for elementary teachers for computer science education, and then my background's in music education.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Stapleton. I am a computer science teacher in Virginia, and I also like video games and was trained as a music teacher.
So just for 30 seconds, what's your proudest video game moment? Let's go.
I beat Mega Man 2.
I finally decided to stop trying to defeat Sans. At an emotional level, not because I couldn't.
So without any spoilers for those of you who haven't played it, I got Omni Slash on Disc 1 in Final Fantasy VII so I could try and one-hit some important boss to try and prevent something from happening. It didn't work.
I did Fire Emblem, Path of Radiance, and Radiant Dawn using the same save file, no deaths, expert mode. That's my proudest moment.
Yay, nerds. All right, so today's panel, I am a music education researcher at Purdue, and what I realized is we had no music education research being produced or shared here at MAGFest. And so I wanted to get a bunch of people who have done music education and learning research. I mean, there have been a couple, but specifically about music learning and music education. And so I just started going to the social media and saying, who wants to do it? You're in. Cool. And unfortunately, Sigrid Javier from Norway was supposed to be here, but couldn't get funding to get here, so we won't be able to have her wonderful info. But if you follow my Twitter, I will share an audio file of her presentation because she wants to make sure that people can see it. And she did her dissertation on Second Life and living in virtual communities and how she's applied that to the classroom. So it's really fascinating. But we are going to talk a little bit about the type of research we're doing, the methodologies, and some of the results. And then we're going to hopefully have enough time to give you some time for questions and answers. And realize that the stuff that we're presenting today isn't everything we've done. So we might be able to also talk about other things if you have any questions about music, learning, and education. So we're going to start off, the panels are up here. I'll have emails at the end, and it's up to them if they put their stuff on their slides. So Jared, you're up.
So we're given 9 minutes, so I'm going to kind of script this just to make sure I stay on time. So I'm going to talk about blurring boundaries across disciplines, and in particular kind of look at ChipTunes as a way to do that. So my research interests have explored educational intersections of music engagement within, through, and around video games. So for example, of engagement within video games, you might think of rhythm games or Minecraft note blocks or ABC and freestyle music making. An example of engagement through video games, you might think of modding and coding, Machinima, or ChipTunes. And then examples of engagement around video games might include like film scoring, performing, or discussing video game music. So when exploring such forms of participation, I was particularly captured by chiptune practices that appeared to blur disciplinary boundaries. So to study this for my dissertation, I looked at chipmusic.org, which housed over 11,000 registered members from around the world at the time of the study. And I extracted several years of data, which resulted in 245,098 discussion forum posts, which is nearly 11 million total words and over 150,000 unique words of data. So a lot of content, and I'm going to summarize it in 9 minutes. To analyze this massive amount of data, I used corpus-assisted discourse analysis tools and techniques. So the analysis cycle consisted of 2 interconnected and cyclical phases. So phase 1 revealed patterns of discourse using some corpus analysis techniques, and then phase 2 consisted of a close reading of the revealed patterns using discourse analysis techniques. So I grouped findings from this analysis cycle within 7 interconnected themes. So composition practices, performance practices, maker practices, coding practices, entrepreneurial practices, visual art practices, and community practices. So I'm going to very briefly summarize all of these, but I'll share a link at the end if you want to see the actual dissertation to unpack more of it. So members of chipmusic.org appear to share and discuss chiptune compositions more than each of the other themes. To create these compositions, members frequently discuss using trackers such as Little Sound DJ, LSDJ, pictured on the left, or digital audio workstations such as Ableton Live, pictured on the right. Although members discuss composition practices the most, discussions on performance practices occur frequently. For example, members discuss a multitude of performance-related hardware and often perform as soloists or less frequently with small ensembles with mixed acoustic and electronic instrumentation. So for example, one of the ensembles discussed in the forum used a tuba, a banjo, voice, and a Game Boy, which is an awesome combination. So although composition practices and performance practices are typical within many music education contexts, the remaining themes demonstrate the potential to blur disciplinary boundaries. So for example, Nintendo Game Boys and other retro video game and computer hardware have limited sound output and quality due to hardware designs intended for headphones or small speakers rather than for performing or recording. So to enable the composition and performance practices with such devices, members engage in what I refer to as maker practices to modify hardware.
You're over there.
Notes got cut off. I'm fixing that. So for example, the 4 pictures on the screen are all modified DMGs, which is short for Game Boy Dot Matrix game. But in mod culture practices, there are 2 types of hardware mods. So aesthetic mods and functionality mods. Calm down. The findings from this study parallel mod culture as members engage in aesthetic mods such as painting and dyeing, laser engraving, adding LEDs behind cases or buttons, adding accessories, and other physical modifications. So functionality mods change the way hardware performed or functions. So for example, Pro Sound mods added audio ports to devices to improve audio output for performing and recording. Backlighting practices are used to improve the screen's brightness, change the color, or improve the contrast, which makes it easier to see when performing. And clocking mods allow members to alter the pitch of a device by turning the knobs you see on these DMGs. And circuit bending practices involve experimenting with making and breaking electrical connections to find unique sounds and effects. And other physical mods include turning a controller into a vaporizer or adding screens or buttons to consoles. Within the maker practices, members engaged in specialist language, shared electrical circuit diagrams and schematics, as well as discussed soldering practices. So such practices are atypical for many music education contexts. However, some members indicate these practices are a part of making music. Modding is really fun. For me, it's part of the enjoyment of making music on Game Boys. Others indicate these practices are a requirement for making chiptunes. Game musicians require mods to make the act of recording and performing music created using them easier. So in addition to modifying existing hardware, members also designed and manufactured devices, which is one of the reasons why I refer to this theme as making rather than modding. For example, the picture on the left is an interface that allows contemporary computers to connect with a retro console, the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. The other 2 computers are software interfaces this member coded to control the hardware. Which leads to the next theme, coding practices. So members of chipmusic.org shared and discussed source code as well as suggestions for learning how to code by modifying existing software or creating new software for chiptune-related performances. For example, members collaboratively developed software known as Lightwall, which uses the Nintendo Entertainment System to create a visual display system for live performing. The image on the right is a picture of a member performing with the software for a live gig. So the discussion forum members of chipmusic.org discuss practices I describe as entrepreneurial practices. The most common practice involves promoting chiptune compositions or events through a mixture of media such as text-based promotions, videos, or digital flyers such as the GIF on the right. In addition, members sold, purchased, and traded many of the aforementioned products or media created by members of chipmusic.org within the discussion forum or through online stores members created. So for example, the image on the right is a chiptune album released on a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive console that a member composed, manufactured, and sold. Another theme was that was interconnected with the others was visual art practices. So for example, members discussed video mixing during a live performance to display manipulated or glitchy visuals. You may have seen some of these practices in the concerts going on here. Or using audio editing techniques to data bend images with audio software such as Audacity. So you'd essentially load an image file into an audio program, you'd start manipulating things, and then essentially turn it back into an image, and you get something like this. So throughout each of the previously discussed themes, members engaged in what I refer to as communal practices, such as creating challenges or competitions, or engaging in democratic practices, constructive criticism, and collaboration. While I've only briefly discussed each theme, the themes work together to solve the problem of being able to create music through retro computer and video game hardware. Such a blend of practices for the purpose of creating music with chiptune-related hardware demonstrates the potential for chiptunes as an exemplar of transdisciplinary learning or as an entirely new interdiscipline. I'm fortunate to have experience as both a music educator and computer science educator, so I'd like to discuss the intersections of those two disciplines in relation to the findings of my dissertation. The concepts, practices, and understandings promoted within a curriculum or program can shape not only how a learner thinks about music or computer science, but the ways a learner engages with music or computer science in such context. Although it is impossible to include all music or CS-related concepts, practices, and understandings within any given curriculum or program, what is left out of a curriculum can also impact how learners engage with music and CS within formalized educational contexts. It is what is referred to as null curricula by curriculum scholars. So this leads to some questions. So for example, is there a space in computer science standards and curricula for students to compose or perform live music? To flip the question, is there a space in music standards and curricula for the maker and coding practices briefly discussed in this presentation? What about the entrepreneurial or visual art practices? In the completed dissertation, I discussed how a rewording of the National Core Arts Standards could enable many of the practices discussed within chipmusic.org. However, rather than having to rewrite standards or curricula to account for null curricula, my hope is this dissertation provides an example of how music educators and computer science educators could work together in trans, inter, or multidisciplinary spaces to encourage practices that blur boundaries in a holistic manner. Such an approach to blurred boundaries resembles scholarship around maker culture, which suggests it can be argued that aspects of maker practices are drawn from or resemble certain disciplinary practices. But no one discipline or singular set of established disciplinary practices captures the essence of participation in the making community. Although members of chipmusic.org engage in practices from a multitude of academic disciplines for music-related purposes, no singular academic discipline accounted for all the practices members discussed. Although 9 minutes is not nearly enough time to unpack all the implications from nearly 11 million words of data, I did my best in the dissertation to unpack it more. So if you're interested in actually reading it, you can find it for free on my website, which you can access on any of that stuff. And it's titled A Corpus-Assisted Discourse Analysis of Chiptune-Related Practices in chipmusic.org, which is a mouthful.
We'll have, between each speaker, we'll have 1 minute for any clarifying questions, and then we'll have larger questions at the end. Does anyone have a clarifying question for Jared? Like something didn't make sense?
I know I went through it
Great
fast.
job. Then. All right, great. You can clap, yeah. Do you want this closer? Are you good?
I'm good. Can I use the thing?
So next we have John Stapleton, and he's going to talk about music learning and chiptunes.
Down. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm John Stapleton. I also studied chiptune for a research project a couple years ago, and so I'm going to talk about that. It's connected to Jared's work. In fact, Jared and I have known each other for quite a while. And so I hope that you can start to draw some connections and start thinking about the conversation around chiptunes in music ed broadly. There's a couple people talking about this right now. So I also have a script, so pardon me for looking down, and I'll do my best to stick to it. All right. This talk comes out of my master's thesis, an autoethnographic investigation into music making, learning, and teaching practices in the chiptune community. So while Jared focused on like a platform and a space, I'm focusing on skills and practices, talking to individuals in interviews and stuff like that, guided by my personal experiences. So as far as methods go, it's an investigation into my experiences that's contextualized by talking to other people who are not me about their experiences, and kind of put that all together into one big pot and see what pops out. That's kind of the basic idea. I learned to make chiptunes using Game Boys over the course of about 3 years, and used those experiences to inform a research project that interrogated my experience as a music learner in the chiptune community. I also interviewed 6 other chip musicians about their community music learning practices. And in the end, I put all these stories together along with a survey that I released on a couple of different platforms to try to get at 4 different research questions. They're up there. What does musicianship in chiptune communities look like? What role does community play? What are the music learning practices of chiptune musicians? What do we actually do when we learn how to make chiptune as opposed to other kinds of music? And what, if anything, can be learned about contemporary musicianship by inquiring into chiptune culture? So I'm going to go through each of these 4 questions and talk about them. So first, what does musicianship look like in the chiptune community? This kind of gets at the definition of chiptune, which if you are in chiptune, it's kind of elusive. It's a difficult one. Most scholarly definitions of chiptune fall somewhere along a continuum from music made using video game consoles to a collection of related music production and performance practices sharing a history with video game soundtracks. But as different tools have become integrated into kind of music making practices outside of chiptune, chiptune musicians have taken those, integrated them into their musicianship, and have maintained a commitment to the sound of video game music. It's kind of a broad conception of video game music. Chiptune is a diverse group of musicians. It's a diverse community of musical aesthetics, and so all these different definitions kind of fall short. Contemporary chip musicians use combinations of digital and analog tools ranging from contemporary to vintage to create and perform music. Performance practices generally mirror those found in other genres of music like hip hop or EDM, and chip musicians curate highly individualized workflows based on what might be characterized as intergenerational tool sets. So Ableton and a Game Boy, 2019, 2020, 1989, together at once. Interesting. Some point to hardware, like game consoles, as the defining characteristic of chiptune music, while others rely on identifying a common aesthetic. And that common aesthetic can be 8-bit sounds or 16-bit sounds or whatever. But as Jared talked about, chiptune musicians are also incorporating some interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary skills into their musicianship, like hardware modding and social media practices and entrepreneurship and all this other stuff that I kind of take as part and parcel of that musicianship. So second, what are the music learning practices of chiptune musicians in the chiptune community? So I have a chart showing some of the ways people learn to make chip music. We can just get at that answer right now. There it is. That's what people do to learn chip music, according to them, at least. This is from a survey and some other sources, and it's not like here's what people said. It's I looked through some responses to data and kind of tried to categorize it, and this is what we found. These are the different ways people learn how to make chiptune music, at least the people I talked to and who responded to my survey. You can see that people talked about experimenting. There's but a diverse range of different techniques that are found in traditional educational contexts and also that are not found in traditional educational contexts. Save files, software documentation, different community practices. Very few people learned how to make chiptune music in isolation, so community played a very important role. And also very few described having a teacher or learning in any formal capacity. This doesn't mean that chiptune musicians don't learn music in formal spaces. Many of them came to chiptune from other areas of musicianship or music and have integrated that training or learning into their current practices. So someone may have been like a classical violinist and then decided to make chiptune. So that kind of bring that identity. In all cases, the people I talked to define their learning in terms of community, not in terms of skills or benchmarks that they reached. The things that chiptune musicians learn, the skills, practices, tools, and techniques they develop are not set in stone. They are changing constantly. The skills that one person brings to their music are not the same as someone else, and lots of different kinds of music and musicians fall under the chiptune umbrella. The people I talked to expressed an appreciation for the openness of folks in the chiptune community and the kind of open aesthetic, and they value the different approaches and perspectives of people who make chiptune. I personally experienced a sort of online learning utopia that you sometimes see people describe in online learning research. One that is decentralized, democratic, fostering personal connections and community building around a common affinity. However, not everyone I spoke with experienced the same thing. My privilege protected me from some of the violent, hateful, and traumatic discourses present in these same online spaces that I found to be safe. Some of the people I talked to described homophobic, transphobic, and misogynist attacks on them and others. They even described being threatened with violence or sexual violence at shows or conventions like this one. Some of these people left these online spaces and these physical sites of community and formed other spaces where they could participate in music learning safely. Other people described how the other community members mobilized to protect the community space and the people within it. But that's to say that online learning research that looks into these communities, we aren't catching everyone in that net of research. People leave for good reasons. Lastly, where's the thing? Oh, there it is. What can we learn about contemporary musicianship through the chiptune community? I have found that contemporary musicianship and music learning can be difficult to pin down. Aside just from making, recording, producing, performing music, musicians create their own instruments, improve on existing ones. They participate in online communities, partly or completely situated online, and these communities appear and disappear with the same dynamism that characterizes other aspects of contemporary online culture. It's ephemeral. It kind of goes and disappears and changes rapidly. Researchers call these communities of practice or participatory cultures or semiotic social spaces, and if you're interested in reading about any of that stuff, I can help you out. Affinity spaces, which Jared has done some work on as well. In my work, I have described the chiptune community as rhizomatic, and here we have a nice visual. A rhizome is a structure that has no center. So you see this tree has a center, has a stem, has a taproot. That's its central defining origin point. But a rhizome, the thing on the right there, is centerless. It doesn't have an origin point that you can identify by looking at the structure as a whole. Because of its eclectic history, chiptune also has no center, like a rhizome. There's no stable definition of chiptune mastery or virtuosity like there is in academic music. It depends on how you make chiptune. Do you use LSDJ? Do you use Ableton? Are you making fake bit? Are you making demos, like demo scene stuff? It's all different, right? And so how can you define what that center point that learners are working their way towards to be? I don't think that you can, really. I came to chiptune through hardware hacking, but others have their own entry points. There's no gateway to entry like an audition. As people pass into the chiptune community, they map a unique learning trajectory, drawing on their previous skills and experiences and developing dialogue with other musicians in the community. So moving forward, I think there needs to be more inquiry into two kind of central points. Marginalization in the chiptune community, and the role of non-human actants and objects on learners and learning practices. You can read some of these questions that I have for future research up there. I think that's it for my time. I might have gone a little over, sorry. Thank you all for your time.
When you said that's my time, it hit 9 minutes exactly. That was awesome. It was exact. All right, so John, can I have the clicker? And is there any clarifying questions for John?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So you talked a lot about how there's no centralized learning for chiptune, and a lot of that seems to stem because, unlike classical music, there's no people tend to modify their instruments in chiptune. Would you say that a lot of the reason there's no formalized learning is because there's all this variation in the instruments?
Yeah, just to clarify the question for the folks listening at home, if I can paraphrase, your question was do I think that chiptune is centerless because these instruments and objects we're dealing with are changing and are different for everybody? Is that a fair summary? Great. So yes, the answer is yes. I am very interested in the role that the objects in music play in the learning process. And I think it's fair to say that the learning process is going to be different for people with different objects. And though we're part of the same community, the artifacts we create, the sounds we create, or the music we're engaging with is going to be different. And so we don't have a aesthetic goal in mind necessarily. We have a community engagement goal in mind as being part of that chiptune community. Does that answer?
Thank you, and we'll give John some more time later if you choose to talk to him during the question section. So we're going to move to John Peasant and his work on middle school band practicing. Yeah. All right, great, thanks.
All right, I will try not to go over 9 minutes. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you guys for coming out and allowing me to share a little bit of my dissertation research pursuits with you. First and foremost, in full transparency, I'd like to let you guys know that I am a music educator and a gamer. More so that I was more into video games and video game culture as a student than I was into my own instrument, meaning that I wasn't doing a lot of practicing, but I was doing a lot of Street Fighter and Sonic and getting fussed at by my parents, but so is life. Of course, I did practice my instrument as any band student should, but I was always quick to put down my horn and pick up a video game controller or head to the arcade once I was done. As time marched on, I ultimately chose instrumental music education as my profession. Yet I'll always still play video games, specifically music video games, revolving around melodic and rhythmic stimuli such as Dance Dance Revolution, Parappa the Rapper, as their gaming mechanics, as an escape from the everyday. However, things changed when I decided to integrate the use of music video games with my students and general music students and band students as I got into the profession. Upon observation, I noticed that the students that experienced such success with rhythm games such as Dance Dance Revolution, Just Dance, and Rock Band also had a better time perceiving rhythm, pitch, and melodic form within classroom rehearsals. While some of their success may have come from a familiarity of such games, I could not help but to think more could come out of this type of gameplay. The screaming woman is me, and my students are usually saying that it's just a game. Hint, hint. As technology has advanced since those times of me using these games with my students, the perceptions towards video games and education have evolved. More specifically, the digital gamification of learning is starting to become more commonplace than ever a mere decade ago. However, this type of instruction has yet to be seen or fully realized within music education. Therefore, an all-encompassing thing of my research pursuits center around how digital games and gamified processes can help music education. This leads me to the problem I study. To establish growth in musical skills, students must engage in the concept of deliberate practice. And while researchers have studied ways to teach students to practice more efficiently, the problem of motivating them to practice and utilizing effective practice strategies still remain. Additionally, digital games have been found to increase student motivation and achievement in a number of studies. After examining the literature in music practice and digital gamification, it seems possible that an approach to the problem of student practice might be to gamify the music practice experience using digital technology. Yet there are no empirical studies that explicitly in that area of music practice and digital gamification that have been conducted. Therefore, the purpose of my dissertation was to examine the effect of digital gamification on middle school students' musical practice. And the research questions I sought to answer included the following. How does digital gamification impact students' motivation to practice? How can digital gamification be used to teach students practice strategies? And what are the students' and teachers' attitudes and perceptions of the digital gamification process? As described by scholars Caswell, Mettler, Gilhamstay, Kenyon, the case study research design is a useful tool to examine the complexities of an individual environments and cultures, patterns, behaviors, and beliefs. This leads to the design being more impactful than other types of reporting. When paired with an embedded method design, the collection of both qualitative data through interviews and open-ended responses, and qualitative data through questionnaires and closed-ended items may strengthen the research and provide more compelling answers to the research questions. My study used the convergent parallel methods approach with a case study design that collected both data sets. The qualitative data that was collected was through a research-developed user practice and digital gamification questionnaire, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as analytics from the gaming platform itself. The qualitative data that was obtained came from field notes, observations, and 2 interview sessions, 2 focus groups with students that participated in the study, and an interview with the band director because that information matters. There. The participants of my study involved a middle school band director and a class of middle school band students. Specifically, the participants were drawn from a 7th grade class that met every other day during block scheduling at the end of the day. The research site was a K-12 laboratory school within a major southeastern university, which was convenient to the researcher. While the school functioned like many other schools, the big thing about this school is that it had a one-to-one policy, and that every student had a piece of technology that they could take home. In fact, this was the suitability of this fact, as well as the suitability of potential participants, accessibility to conduct the research from the site, and the band director's willingness to participate made the school an appropriate place for the study. The first tool collection involved the distribution of the music practice and digital gamification questionnaire, a 53-item instrument that was developed from pre-existing questionnaires and studies based on practice motivations, and perceptions of learning through video games. The MP-DG key was administered before and was administered after the online platform unit, and the results were calculated through descriptive analysis and the use of the non-parametric Wilcoxon sign rank test. Now, the critical component of the study was the use of the digital gamification platform Classcraft. I'd like to, if the video can come up, let's see.
Is this a video?
Yeah, I think you have to click it. Okay, well, created in 2013, Classcraft is an online platform used to develop gamified activities, facilitate classroom management, and increase student engagement with gameplay similar to the board game Dungeons & Dragons or the massively online multiplayer online game World of Warcraft. Within the past few years, there have been studies and discussions on Classcraft's impact on education. The literature showed that Classcraft's design is incredibly helpful in establishing classroom management through gameplay, but had positive implications on student engagement, maintaining motivation through instruction, and provide useful general feedback. From Classcraft's discussion boards in a recent podcast, the platform's strength in the music classroom comes from its ability to allow educators to self-design, self-paced instructional requests, as well as to curb behaviors through classroom management. The nature of the study's unit revolved around the use of practice quests. Once a week, the participants embarked on a quest that centered around a research practice strategy. At the end of a 5-day period, the students submitted a practice chart in the learned practice strategy, self-determined goals, and objectives prescribed by the band director. There was also the use of a goal-based practice chart, which the students turned in. They simply had to check off. They didn't have to tell the nature of how much time they spent on a particular goal, but they simply checked off each of the assigned pieces for every day, and that was the basis of what type of award they got through Classcraft. Man, that was tough. All right. Let's see. I'll just cut to the chase for a moment. The findings from my research include the following. You had a basic makeup of a smaller version of a middle school band class. I wanted an N of 30, but I ended up getting an N of 16. And I'm just going to have you guys kind of sketch over the data. The big thing about question 1 is that students still saw the nature of practicing as important per se to them, but they didn't necessarily see video games being a complete motivator for this type of practice. While some students still kind of, let me get over to the summative thoughts. That was quick, man.
You do have one more.
Okay. While most students had neutral feelings towards practicing, a fair amount agreed that practicing improves weak points, helps them to develop other parts of themselves, and are generally excited while practicing. This is not the case with every student. Not every student is engaged in that type of gameplay at home. Therefore, you cannot use this as the golden arrow, if you will, for that type of problem. Concerning practice knowledge, they believed that marking down mistakes with a pencil was the most important tool and felt neutrally about practice charts or using goals, although they did quote that Classcraft was kind of helpful in this endeavor. And when faced with challenges, it's easier to use repetition or go on to another piece as another practice piece. And when it comes to using video games in instruction, that was one of the significant findings. not necessarily to learn how to play music or to learn music through video games, but and to generally learn through video games was a significant finding through the questionnaire. I'm sorry, that was kind of a condensed version of all the information, but if you have any questions, please hit me up. Thank you.
We'll take one clarifying for right now.
I was just wondering about, you said this is a school with one-to-one technology.
Yes.
I was wondering about your thoughts on making gamification accessible to all students. I work in a school that's Title I, and a lot of my students don't have access to technology.
Most definitely.
How would you recommend educators incorporate gamification and still make it accessible to students who don't have technology at home?
I will say that coming from a Title I background as well, the one constant I have seen, and this is kind of to a point where I kind of got mad at it too, a lot of kids sneak personal technology. And while there are students that just simply don't have this type of technology at home, I think that's starting to become more accessible to students in Title I situations. A lot of them are starting to have smartphones, and while this may not be the case with everybody, there's got to be a way to kind of mainstream these types of technologies into mobile devices such as tablets or phones. That way every child has accessibility. Now it comes to the nature of the design of the software, but if you find one that's multifaceted, then you may have something that can be used with everybody.
Something in an app form would be.
Most definitely.
Okay.
And some districts are actually creating their own Wi-Fi or giving out devices that students can take home that have data available on it, because some of the districts I've worked in, they didn't actually have internet at home, so it was impossible for them to connect with stuff. So that's an alternative solution.
Thank you. All right, so now I'll share with you a little bit of my research. So I've looked a lot at informal music learning, which is how people kind of learn outside of school on their own with friends and that type of thing. So that's informal music learning. That'll come back a bunch. And how that fits into schools and how we can maybe integrate that as a supplement to waving a stick at children. Conducting, for those of you who didn't get that one. So the field sites that I've focused on has been YouTube, and how YouTube artists use that platform to develop community, start learning with each other, and perform. The methodologies that I've used are mostly been case study, and thanks, John, for saving my time of telling them what case study is, but it's really looking at the specificity or the uniqueness of a thing, a case, and a case study binds that or puts boundaries around those things so you don't go off into rabbit holes, because you can imagine looking at something and then, ooh, that looks interesting, and then just flying off there, but then having to come back. So you kind of bind things and put it in a nice package. And then I've also looked at internet inquiry, which is using the internet as a field site to conduct research. So my first look at VGM was on Undertale, and I did a multiple case study, 12 different cases looking at how YouTube musicians used Undertale or video game music as inspiration to create, learn, and develop community. And so last year I did a panel with some of my participants. Row right there, fourth from the right, or the fourth one in from the left. He told me about MAGFest. I'm like, I've got to check this out. And so that brought me to 2018. And so I did a study at MAGFest 2018. Maybe some of you saw it and were part of it. Yes, thank you. So how do video game musicians acquire the skills that they need to publish, produce, and perform online? And that was my research question. And I gave people two-side survey. I was carrying this crazy sign that they asked me about my research, looking for video game musicians, and then I gave them a wristband that said MAGFest and, I don't know, musical gamer, I think is what it had on there. So if you had those, they're limited time or limited quantities. What I was looking for is some demographics, age, race, gender, and then how many times they've been at MAGFest. I asked them to describe who they are. So who are you in 3 words as a musician? How do you you perform and present and produce music online? Where do you do that? And then how did you learn the skills that you needed? And I looked at 3 different places: school, institutional learning outside of school, and informal music learning, or informal learning. And then finally, I asked a bunch of questions about MAGFest to see how they felt about relationships at MAGFest, learning, music making, collaboration, interpersonal issues, teaching, and audiences at MAGFest, and how you can interact with audiences. So, how many of you have a statistical background? Oh, right. So 4 of you might know what I'm talking about. I'll try to translate it into English. So I asked people how they performed, and they had to rate on 3 different scales: video game music, non-video game music, online, offline, and live or recorded. And then here's some statistical analysis of that. This is just descriptive statistics, but you'll see that in the center there's the most people, then somewhat more or less, and then a little bit less or maybe not. So in the first one, video game music versus non-video game music, it was kind of a bell curve, all right? The most in the middle, and then less as they get mostly, and then even less of that I only do video game music or I only do non-video game music. But you'll see in the live and recorded, it's skewed over to the mostly recorded. And then on the online and offline, it's skewed mostly to the online. That makes a lot of sense because I was asking for people who published video game music online. At the time, Twitch was starting to get bigger, but you'll see that when I looked at video game music versus online, you see that it's mostly in the middle, but then there's this push over towards online video game music. Good, that's the participants I was looking at. And you look over here, you've got video game music versus live or recorded. It was mostly, there's a push towards recording, which makes sense. Twitch hadn't really gotten around extremely popular yet. And then you've got just a nice line up there with the online versus recorded. So people were, you've got offline live music was more popular, online recording music was more popular, and there was some correlation, but those stats are a little harder to understand, so I'm just going to gloss over that. Where did they publish? You'll see that YouTube was the most common place people were at, with 75% of people. A lot of people used Facebook, and Bandcamp was the most used video purchase or music purchasing site, which makes sense because it's catered towards amateur. I didn't have a ton of commercial artists taking the survey, but there definitely were some. So how did they learn the skills that they needed? Everyone except for one participant informally learned. So they were asking what the IL, informal learning, from people. They were asking questions of people. They were reading it in texts, and they were learning through recordings. They would listen to something, try to repeat it, that type of thing. And then I also looked at how did they do that with music and how they do that with technology, because producing online music, you have those 2 different literacies or areas of learning. Within or outside of institutions, you'll see that obviously the conferences, everyone had been to a MAGFest except for 2 participants in the 27 through 32 age, or they had been here long enough to be able to talk about their experience at MAGFest. Like they took the survey on the last day as opposed to right when they got there. And then here are the school activities. One of the most important things I thought, if you want to just look at the right column, those are the totals. It's divided by age, but on the right column, you'll notice that only 62% of participants had taken a technology course. So it would make sense that they're probably learning that somewhere else outside of school. There were a lot of performance classes, 97%. Only like 2 people in the 23 through 27 didn't take a class that was a performance. And importantly, 80% of the respondents had been taking theory classes. So how helpful were the approaches? This is how they had to answer it. Extremely helpful to extremely unhelpful. and they rated all those all those things that I asked. And so for those of you stat nerds out there, my hypothesis was activity A was more useful than activity B. Then there's a null hypothesis, blah blah blah. Basically, I did a test, and if it's a certain level, the ones on the column or the left column, that's more important or more helpful than the one on the top. So you'd have to look at like, was music theory more helpful than 11? And 11 is workshops. Okay, so this is how you look at this thing. If the number is less than 0.05, it was like, yeah. If it was less than 0.01, it was like, oh yeah. And if it was less than 0.001, which all the, like just has asterisks, it's like, well, yeah, wow, okay. Really significant level of this was more more useful. So I'll just let you stare at that for a few seconds. You'll notice that music theory courses have a lot of stars. So that was significantly more helpful than most of the other things on there. Informal music learning was extremely helpful for a lot of those things. And soon this should be published, so follow me on Twitter. I'll let you know. And so also another thing that I ran was how did these things correlate? And all those correlations right there are, if you thought that history was important, you'd also think that technology was important. And they all happen to be positive correlations, so it was they go in the same direction. All of those are there. Again, I'll send you the data if you ask for it. And then finally, looking at the questions about MAGFest, I have that, but I really can't, I'm out of time already, so I can't go farther. But I'd love to chat with people about this. I didn't have a whole dissertation, I just did one study, so. Is there a clarifying question for me? Yeah. So there were 135 participants, which is only 0.06% of the MAGFest population, which seems like very, very little. But so that's what you have to think about with my data. However, there's no way to tell of the 22,000 people who came who actually published music online. A lot of people are just fans, a lot of people are just gamers, and so we don't know. So it's an exploratory study, and I used statistical cutoffs at 0.05 significance because that's what has been an acceptable practice for exploratory studies. So that's my one clarifier, but now we'll open it up for everyone. Please feel free to address a question to all of us or any one specific person.
Well, I noticed you all, came together because of the studies you've done. I'm wondering what you think of the potential for longitudinal studies here at MAGFest, considering you did a study in the past here. Have you considered doing anything long-term? And if so, what might that explore, or what might that look like?
That'd be super cool. Challenges include finding musicians before they are like Twitter famous. Most of the people I talked to, I knew through social media, through my kind of individual experience. But super cool, right? Because you get to see how someone who's kind of embedded develops and learns as a musician and kind of what trajectory they take.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be really cool to explore MAGFest longitudinally. This is what, year 19, 17? And so that's hard because one, you never know who's going to show up and keep showing up. So that's a challenge. Number two is ethics. And so a lot of ethical practices for researchers who are state funded have to go through this process called IRB, which is Internal Review Board. And some of you are twitching. So you have to deal with that. And so to collect identifiable data, meaning in my survey, if I asked for an email address, I had a lot more hoops to jump through if I asked for that. So what I did is said, is there anything that you'd like to tell me about yourself? And I was able to do that and let them give me that information. So just giving a survey right through IRB pretty much. It was really easy, no identifiable data. But as soon as you ask for someone's information that can get back to them, it gets real sticky. We can talk more about that later. We should probably do a session on that next year. Thank you. Yeah, so that would be the challenge with longitudinal data. That being said, you could do individual MAGFests over and over again with, so the longitudinal aspect would be about the organization or the field site, not necessarily people. So yeah, what the questions could ask or answer, anyone want to jump on that one?
So technically, if I had asked different questions, my data was considered archival data, so it like immediately was approved by IRB. So it was like 6 or 7 years worth of data, but I wasn't looking at the change in discourse over time or like how things were evolving or whatever. So I could take that data and look at it in that way and kind of try and do some longitudinal stuff, but that wasn't part of my research questions. So you could easily do it with discourse.
And not for nothing, there's some research that kind of looks at different, I'm thinking chiptune specifically, looking at different generations of chiptune artists and kind of like historical work to track the demo scene. And who's feeding back? Is that me?
I think that's outside.
Oh, okay.
Close the door. Could someone get the door real quick?
But yeah, that's so people have done that work about the community, but not necessarily individuals. That's the big one, right?
And then let's also be clear that the hardest hurdle is finding people and money to do those things.
Yeah.
So how many of you got funded for your research?
What?
I did. I was able to get $1,500 for me to travel to MAGFest, to create my recruitment. So that included buying wristbands, that included buying posters, and so I got lucky. And I'm a professor, so I got time. And I'm still, I mean, it's 2 years later, and I'm still putting time into this project to get it published. So yeah, that's the other hurdle. And I think I wanted to give time to that question because it asks a lot of questions, addresses a lot of the issues that I wanted to talk about at this panel. So yeah, thank you very much. Any other questions? Ellen?
Is there like a centralized hub for this VGM research that you all are doing in other people, or is it basically just...
Is there a centralized hub for VGM research? Google Scholar. Any other ideas?
Yeah, there's a...
The Google Scholar is great, but also if you look at these dissertations, they have their work cited, and those are essentially hubs for VGM research, because part of the work of a dissertation is to pull together as much research as you possibly can and figure out what everyone's saying. So those are really excellent resources as well, though they're not as accessible as something like like an online database that's specifically for VGM research.
And there's a need. This is a big need, and so there aren't any books in music ed. There are a couple books in media studies and media history, but it's still a young genre. Video games and video game music are very young genre areas of interest. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm a noob. This is my first MAGFest, but I would kind of like to know. Oh, thank you. I would kind of like. It's great flavor, but I kind of like to know like how many educators we actually have in the audience. So my big thing as this goes on, and hopefully this won't be my last MAGFest, how many educators are kind of coming in, whether it be art, whether it be music, whether it be social sciences. I would like to know how many are coming to these type of festivals, and if these type of practices that we have here kind of pass on to our students, you know? There's the nature of the letting the freak flag fly, but if I was going back to my classroom and tell my students how much of an experience this has been, there's going to be that student who will come to me with questions, and I want to be able to answer those questions they may have, because not everybody that I grew up with was into anime when I was coming in, and to now see it blossom into kind of a cultural phenomenon over the past 20 years. There's going to be that kid that wants to know a little more about that history. I'm kind of glad to be able to be around people who actually can answer those questions for me now.
So I was just looking this up to make sure I got it right. So there's, it went away. The Society for the Study of Sound and Music in Games, sssmg.org, that has a bibliography page that has, like, if I were to scroll through this, it just keeps going and going of stuff that's related to this that might be in alignment with what you're looking for.
And for anyone who's interested in kind of digging into the research literature from academia, this is just one slice, right? We're all kind of coming at this from an education perspective. Also, I know in years past there's been panels about musicology, which is kind of a separate lens and facet of this issue. And finding those people, following them on Twitter, is just a great way of keeping up with their work and getting a sense of the conversation broadly without having to do the work of reading everything, which can be daunting.
Also, Game Grooves has some really cool links. Any other questions? Yes.
Before my current role, I was an IT administrator for a school of education source. And so one question I kind of had is like, you mentioned having a 1-to-1 ratio for students and technology. What particular, what did that look like for something?
They were using Chromebooks.
My school has one-to-one. Loud. My school has one-to-one as well. Chromebooks.
iPads.
So then from that lens, then like one of the questions we kind of come into that would be certain things like web apps should be accessible over an iPad and as well as Chromebook. Certain things that are like Apple will be accessible on the iPad. So what would you, Apple Store, sorry, what would you say in your opinion would be, it's like that's for an IT administrator, what can we provide? What would you say is the question I think we need to ask you to help you?
You need to know what you want to do, and then develop your stuff around that. I like multi-tracking and ease of recording, and so iPads made the most sense. But I wrote a grant for my classroom, and so I have iPads, one per every student. Those are out there. Grants exist. You have to know how and where to look for them, and ask around over and over and over again. There's a lot of local ones that you can probably get. Each state has a music and a technology. Like you can spin it however you want. Oftentimes, I found that, hey, I'm doing STEM and music at music. Give me money. That really is a one way to approach it. And so you need to know what you want, and you can do Chromebooks, iPads. Don't let the technology move you. Take the technology that you want to be able to do what your goal is. Anyone else want to say anything?
If any other IT administrator people in the audience, the biggest barrier for me and my people in my role as a teacher is the fact that we don't have access to these communities, and that's a complicated request because of the fact that there is a lot of danger in online communities, especially as you go down the age, level. And that's tricky, but also to learn in my case the chiptune community, you need to be able to be in the chiptune community, and schools are bounded, right? They have walls up around them, literally sometimes and definitely figuratively. So something to think about, especially as all of us are in communities where there are schools. You can start to advocate for these modes of learning that you've experienced in these online communities, and try to put that in context with the schools in your communities. That would be lovely.
Yeah, and I'd second that. And in chapter 6 of my dissertation, I actually kind of talk about the problematic side of these online communities, and I break down the use of swear words and like how much is being used. And one of the images is an entire page of "oh" and then a swear word, which I won't say because this is going on YouTube. I don't want to get them in trouble. But the swear word is used over 1,000 times in a single post. So on one hand, it's like I want kids to engage in these communities. On the other hand, the swear word is used 1,000 times in a single post. So it creates some interesting problems to talk through.
We have time for one more.
Oh, no, I just want to add on to that. For all those sites that would be used, or would be a very that has a treasure trove of information that would be useful to kids. Would there be any interest in having such like a kids corner, like a forum just for students, schools, and all of that? It would just be specialized in that regard, or would the demand be enough?
If I was a person creating content for a website, I don't know if I would make it in two areas. Like one where it's like the unfiltered, I'm going to say whatever I want, and then the other version is I know I'm being recorded and put on YouTube, so I'm going to put that there. It might be hard.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Here's the email addresses of the people. So if you want to contact anyone, please feel free, and we'll probably stick around, wander the halls. Thank you so much.
Thank you.